that was about the journey to Mars. The next speaker, he's going to Skype in, by the way, modern times, is going to tell us about, we're there to stay. Now, I, for one, was sucked into space exploration by the hard science fiction, and I'm sure that holds for many of us. Good science fiction writers paint us a possible future that's just outside our reach at present, but might come about. Some of the futures painted are grim, even if united willpower can overcome that grimness. Our next speaker is most certainly a member of that group of writers that inspire us to use our ingenuity to the max. David Brin is a scientist, best-selling author, and tech futurist. His main thread, how will we shape the days and years ahead? And how will tomorrow shape us? Well-grounded science and science fiction may be the greatest tool for exploring tomorrow. I'm confident David Brin is going to ignite our passion on how we're going to stay on Mars. David, the floor is yours.
Anybody out there want to shout hi, David?
Hi, David.
Okay. Yeah, I only have about 15 minutes, but I do want to mention that I'll be back east mid-June to give a few talks in Washington, D.C., and in July they have Escape Velocity, which is a new kind of convention being put on by the new Science Fiction Museum that's setting up shop in Washington, D.C. I'll be back there for NIAC, NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts Group. I'm on the board of advisors. And exciting, interesting seed grants are given for things that might help us move along into space. But of course, you're in this room, you're all interested in big projects that can aim at a goal out there. Elon Musk certainly shares your dream. He has the goal of Mars, because Mars is the place where we feel that it's possible that some earlier life may have set its roots there. Some good science fiction has been exploring that possibility lately. But also that human or earthly life might set root there too. And there are many, many issues, but I do want to mention one thing in particular that's more general first, and that is how ridiculous it is that the news media didn't even notice, and most American citizens aren't aware of how 2015 was by far the best year for human exploration in space ever. And I'm including the great astronaut eras of the 60s and early 70s. If you go over the list, and you can Google, my name and best year in space ever, I suppose you'd probably find it. If you go over the list, we've had more bang for our buck, more incredible, spectacular accomplishments in 2015 than probably any other 2 years. And we're hoping that this will continue, because the bang that we get for our scientific buck is increasing with the new technologies. And previous speaker mentioned the Discover probe, which is letting us routinely and daily look at our Earth while looking at the sun. That's bang for your buck. Now, one of the things we've been talking about is, just how difficult it might be to move ahead on very, very limited budgets. And one important thing that happened in the last 3 or 4 years was the administration's opening up of basic launch services into low Earth orbit, and for commercialization. And this was extremely important. People have been talking about it for years, but the administration finally did it. And the result has been spectacular. It turns out that space was hard, and commercialization wasn't possible till the government had invested a certain amount in technologies. But you have to keep your eyes open for a threshold effect when things are ready to take off, and then you have to let go and continue subsidizing. And this was what happened in the 1920s when the burgeoning skill at flying through the sky, flying through the air, was subsidized by government mail contracts. But nevertheless, you wound up opening things up for the barnstorming era. And this barnstorming era, which I portray in my novel Existence, when the rich may subsidize some of our efforts into space. I portray rich people making their own suborbital rockets and blasting themselves from California to the Caribbean. Other possibilities are, because an awful lot of money has been flowing into the top, whatever you want to call it, 0.01%. And some of them are now the basic sources of subsidy for Virgin Galactic and some of these other areas. There's no better way to recycle high wealth than in things we are all going to be using later. And there's talk of the wealthy helping to subsidize a return to the moon, which is fine by me. I'm fine by the Chinese going there and the Europeans. I personally don't favor an American effort aimed at the surface of the moon. I see very little there that's attractive. Most scientists don't either. I see very little there that does us any good, even though my research advisor, Jim Arnold, was the one who predicted ice at the lunar poles. I believe there's just enough ice at the lunar poles for the loonies, for a lunar civilization, for lunar cities. And if we take it away from them in advance to make things that we need in orbit, I think that would be a crime. I think there's more than enough ice we can get from asteroids. And I agree with the administration's emphasis there. And I sit on the boards of some of the asteroid mining companies. The potential there is spectacular for getting access first to water and then other resources that we might need to turn the Earth into a park. One interesting potential former asteroid is, of course, Phobos. And the Russians have always believed that Phobos was, one of the most important places in the solar system. That's why they keep trying to land landers on Phobos and land little medallions on it for whatever reason. But if Phobos turns out to be made of carbonaceous chondritic material, then that would mean there would be water there. And ISRU, I-S-R-U, in situ resource utilization, we all know that that's essential for being able to go to and from Mars, to be able to make your fuel and other consumables on the surface of Mars, as was portrayed in the movie The Martian. But I think concentrating on Phobos first would be a more doable task. That way you can have an orbital station. That way you can be safe from solar storms. And if it were possible to find sources of volatiles of any kind, not just water, on Phobos, then you would be able to use an ISRU plant to create, fill all sorts of fuel tanks and resource tanks, and then radio to Earth saying, I'm ready, my tanks are full, now you can send people. I'm a little disappointed that nobody listened to the crackpot scheme of doing the free return in 2018. Some of you out there are familiar with this concept, the notion that 2018 is the only year for about 30 years in which if we were to launch a mission to Mars, we would get a free return, like happened with the Apollo 13 astronauts. And so the notion was flown that this would be a way of sending a human crewed expedition way, way earlier. They wouldn't land, but they would skate past the dark side of Mars very temptingly and return. And the concept was made that it would be best to send an older, married, planetary scientist couple who've already had their kids. And I was about to volunteer because my wife and I are former planetary scientists, and I'd probably get some writing done. But the I know a couple at JPL, and they eat about a pound of food per year, and they weigh almost nothing, and they're far better qualified than my wife and me. So that would have been cool. I'm racing through a bunch of things, but I did want to make my pitch for Phobos, and I did want to make my pitch that I think that we're on the right emphasis here, with the emphasis on cislunar space. I mentioned I'm not interested in the surface of the moon. Let the rich and the Chinese and the Europeans prove me wrong. Maybe there's helium-3, as in the movie Iron Sky. Only that should be in Gothic letters, helium-3. But cislunar space being a work yard where we can learn our skills and bring in little asteroids and work on them and learn to do work away from low Earth orbit, I'm very approving of that. Now, when it comes to Mars, there's good news and there's bad news. Every year we seem to find that there's more water and more easily accessible than we had thought. That's the good news. There's bad news regarding nitrogen, and there's worse news regarding the perchlorates that we now think may be lacing the very caustic materials that may be lacing the surface of the planet almost everywhere. And if that's the case, then it's going to be really rough, and it's going to be a lot harder to use the materials that we get. Not for rocket fuel. We may still be able to do that very easily, but for the kind of growing of potatoes that we saw in the inspirational movie The Martian. So we're going to have to do a lot more science. But our biggest problem, of course, is America's current state of politics. I personally believe that we're in phase 8 of the American Civil War, and it's just not necessary. Politics has been given a bad name when it is actually a gritty, filthy job that has to be done. And then when it's done well, human beings move ahead. They adjust their civilization. They adjust their rules. And we're going to have to resurrect the word politics from the hell that it's been put in by people on both ends of the political spectrum. Because otherwise, how are we going to get anything done? So I'm going to open things up for questions. I have a couple more points I wanted to make, but I wanted to race through this list of things. And so any of you who have any questions, please use a mic because I can't really hear very well with these headphones. But I'll keep blabbing until somebody says, David, there's a question. So in any event, it was mentioned that science fiction talks about a grim future. Well, there's a reason for that. If you Google David Brin and idiot plot, you'll find an essay in which I explain why there are so many damn dystopias and post-apocalyptic stories today. The biggest reason is laziness, because they're easy to write. They're incredibly easy to write. Your villains are easy, stereotype, ridiculous, completely unmotivated, stupid villains like in that highly overrated Mad Max movie. But in order to write something in which there's actually civilization doing interesting things, you have to have an opposition that is really formidable. And in The Martian, in which everybody is a grown-up in the movie The Martian, that can only happen when you have really substantial opposition, like a whole planet, a planet that's trying to kill your hero. I know I did a post-apocalyptic story called The Postman, which was Kevin Costnerized, and don't ask me about that. But the so but with that post-apocalyptic tale, it was actually about civilization. It was about average people, our neighbors, wanting to bring civilization back. And I think that aspect of it is what Kevin Costner captured very well, other than the fact that it's a very pretty movie, visually and musically. Do we have any questions yet? Has anybody stood up with any questions?
Yes, we have one question.
All right, happy to hear it.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, what is your opinion on... Oh, sorry. So, there's been a lot of talk at this event about if there is life there, like microbial life, that we need to be careful to protect it. Do you have any opinions on this?
Yeah, as usual, I'm contrarian. My blog is called Contrary Brin. So if I'm with people who want to safeguard Mars for the Martians, I can be very caustic. That's not how the universe works. Tell it to the marsupials who dominated South America until the Panama Land Bridge lifted, and placental mammals invaded South America. I mean, stuff happens. On the other hand, if I were in a conference with people who wanted to blast Mars with comets, and make it more habitable, you'd hear me being very protective of the Martians, the Martian microbes. By the way, we almost had that problem solved for us last year, in that great year 2015, when we had 4 robots, 5 robots, 6 robots looking up at comet Siding Springs as it flew past Mars at a quarter of the distance from us to the moon. And there were many of us who were kind of silently having wars inside, because the little boy inside me sure wanted that sucker to smack. That would have made the decision for us. No, I think the answer to your question is to set aside large sections of the planet as reserves. And we need to argue about which those should be, and have areas of the planet on the other side that are set aside for us. It's what we're doing now with national parks, starting with Teddy Roosevelt 100 years ago. We should have started doing it on Earth earlier. Larger portions of the Earth should have been done that way back in the 16th century, but they had lower consciousness. Now, the Mars for the Martians people will answer, things will spread from the side of the planet that we're using. And that's true. Over time, Mars life is going to have to adapt. Cousins are meeting, and when you have reunions, you have family spats. But I think that learning from the non-interference directive is more important, and thus learning from science fiction, and having conversations based on these more simplistic rules is more important than actually following those rules. That's not how the universe works. I hope I answered your question. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, David. This is Matt Kaplan. You wrote about such an expansive future in that novel, Existence. And there are people now saying, oh, humans, we ourselves won't even explore in our own bodies anyway beyond Mars. Maybe we'll settle Mars, but that might be it. What do you think? Do you think we're going to settle on Mars and maybe go further?
Well, I think that the answer to that question, there are many answers to that question, but the real answer to that question is that we're going to define, and I talk about this in Existence. And by the way, there's a 3-minute video trailer, you folks out there, that's the most fun you'll have in 3 minutes with your clothes on. But I believe that the answer is that we're going to redefine what it means to be human. There will be silicon and metal beings, and if we handle AI properly, they will think of themselves as human beings who happen to be of the silicon and metal race. And given that we have been teaching ourselves to expand the circle of inclusion, so that the definition of sovereign citizen, tribal leader, adult now includes groups that were automatically despised before, and in horrible wastes of talent called racism, sexism, and those things, that these expansions of our horizons do not need to be just driven by self-righteous, moralism. but they're driven by pragmatism because we get to stop wasting talent. And if we raise AI as our children, then we'll foster them, we'll adopt them, we'll raise them, and we'll be proud of them. And under those circumstances, human beings who happen to be adapted to space, moving on and exploring the cosmos, and then possibly taking some sperm and ova with them when they go to other star systems so that the old-fashioned biotypes get to share in the adventure. Well, this sounds like a soft landing to our disappointment if we don't get warp drive and those sorts of things. Now, I mentioned NIAC, and at NIAC we're funding some research in torpor, or the very, very beginnings of suspended animation. And if that were to come about, stasis, pods and things like that, well then, stuff opens up for the biotype. So there are all sorts of possibilities in this regard, and I talk about them in a bunch of stories. Oh, let me, as long as we're on science fiction, let me recommend a story that you Mars maniacs might enjoy called Mars Opposition, in which a Martian spacecraft lands at the Kennedy Space Flight Center, and it's the weirdest Martian invasion that you ever saw. So that's in my new short story collection, Insistence of Vision. So do we have any other questions, or shall I save a little bit of time for you guys? Are we still connected?
Yes.
All right.
One more question.
Good day to you. During the break, I was fortunate to be witness to a passionate discussion between two highly respected people from the Marsosphere, in which we were talking about pathogens. And here is a question I didn't have the time to ask of them. We have been living on this planet, and we've been sharing the life of evolution, the tree of evolution with different pathogens, and we've been separated sometimes by tens of thousands of years, like the Europeans and the native Indians. When the Europeans discovered America, they brought with them smallpox, but some native Indians were resistant to it. When they brought back syphilis to Europe, some Europeans were resistant to it. What is the likelihood of bringing back from Mars, with the astronauts coming back, on a human body, a pathogen that will be so different from us, that will never have shared the same tree of evolution with us, that it could wipe out the whole humanity?
Well, actually, I portray that happening in a novella of mine. Geez, what was the name of it? I believe it's in my collection, Otherness. The Giving Plague, and Mars expedition brings back a disease. This is a classic. It's been done by a number of people, and that's why we have a planetary protection office, and that's why people will be treat the returning astronauts and their cargo very, very carefully. I believe that the best place for having these labs would be Salt Lake City, and the reason is that you can contain whatever gets loose in the Great Basin, and it won't run into the oceans. It'll only run into the Salt Lake. And I don't know if anybody's thought of that. Certainly the Salton Sea, also east of San Diego, where I live. We can't let this cripple our outgoing spirit. But it is one good reason to have a good Phobos base. And also possibly near Phobos, a rotating base where astronauts can return and recondition their bodies. I think both are more important than racing to land on Mars. So this is one of the reasons careful due diligence to danger is one of the reasons why, despite the fact that all my adult life I've been engaged in looking outward, and I have been engaged in SETI research, Nevertheless, I am a member of the large group of SETI researchers who have been protesting against METI, or messaging to extraterrestrial intelligence. We think it's a very stupid idea, and to call attention to ourselves prematurely before there has been due diligence and risk analysis. Because there are some potential failure modes to this sort of thing that are related to what you were talking about with the potential for diseases. It's not that we're paranoid about vile Cardassian invaders, and we already have Kardashian invaders, who certainly seem alien enough. In any event, I'm going to thank you all. It's now the hour has reached, and I've reached my limit. And you guys are behind schedule, so you guys need to move along. But you are examples of the spirit that we need to maintain, and I urge you to grab your neighbors gently by the lapel and tell them about how wonderful 2015 was for human exploration, and how wonderful the possibilities are, and how important it is that we listen to Elon, because everyone should listen to Elon and not keep all of our eggs in one basket. So thanks a lot, and good luck to you all.